If you think about it, there are really two big questions in the universe. One, where did we come from? Two, where are we going? This video, I'm going to attempt to give you some scientific evidence to talk about where we came from, the evolutionary history of life. Let's get started. So as we think about life and how life evolved, we can actually document the tree of life with quite a bit of evidence. And we've talked about this in other podcasts. How did life evolve? What's our evidence for evolution? That's pretty easy. We have a lot of evidence. We have a lot of fossils. We have a lot of molecular and DNA evidence to show how life evolved over time. And we can create these fantastic trees from the beginning of life and where things branched off, how animals evolved, how bacteria evolved. We've got a pretty solid understanding of this tree of life. The tougher issue is how it all started, the origin, when life began from no life. So we have to assume that at some point there was no life, and then all of a sudden there was life. So in this podcast, we want to talk about why we think life began and maybe give some evidence to how we think it did begin. So before life, let's think about the universe. Tough questions to consider. How did we go from nothing to something? Well, scientists have some pretty interesting theories. Starting with the Big Bang, the universe set into expansion, right? And so it's not so much that the universe expanded into already space that was already there, but the thing that'll even blow your mind even more is that many physicists think the universe is creating the space that it is expanding to as we go. So we first started with this Big Bang, and then there was a period of dark ages, and then we first start to see the first stars about 400 million years ago, or excuse me, about 400 million years after this. And then as the Big Bang has expanded, we think this occurred about 13.7 billion years ago. As the universe has expanded, of course, we see new galaxies forming. And then within those galaxies, we see new planets, stars collapsing. We know in our Milky Way galaxy, we have the sun and the earth as that revolves around the sun. And so it's in our small little corner of the universe, we can see a few things. But the interesting thing scientists tell us, physicists tell us, is that because it takes light time to travel, we can actually look back in time and see the Big Bang or see evidence of the Big Bang. So to put this in perspective, imagine where we are, this small, minute little speck on our planet, in our galaxy, in maybe even our universe, and that's where we're going to start our discussion about life evolving on that planet. So this is a really interesting slide to me. This is sort of a spiral timeline of life on our planet. So if you think about it, the Earth was formed about 4.6 billion years ago. And in relation to the universe that we just saw on the previous slide, that's really not that old, the Earth. Even though 4.6 billion years is a long time, in relation to some of those other galaxies, we're not that old. Well, life at the beginning of our planet was didn't go so well. It was tough. Our planet wasn't really conducive to a lot of life. So we really see our first fossils, it took about 1 billion years for life to start on our planet. We see some ancient prokaryotic organisms about 3.5 billion years ago. Then finally, oxygen became available on our planet about 2.7 billion years ago, which then led to the ability, of course, to get some eukaryotes starting to appear in the fossil record about 2.1 billion years ago. So, of course, we know modern day animals like us evolved from eukaryotic cells that started to appear back in 2.1 billion years ago. So life slowly evolved, right? You see a few little things popping up here and there. It took another billion or so years. Finally, life exploded when we get to this. We call it the Cambrian Explosion, about 543 million years ago. That's when we really start to see life take off. So you can see from here on, life really takes off. Mammals don't really enter the picture until about 125 million years ago, which is really going to be kind of closer to in here. But you can see, right, the Cambrian explosion comes around. We're starting to see things sort of crawl out of the water, right? Life evolved, we think, to begin with in the water. Then things kind of start to crawl out of the water. And then we see a long period. We can see the Jurassic, of course. We know of Jurassic Park. That's when dinosaurs were really thriving. Mammals really started about 125 million years ago, and then things started to evolve more and more. You'll see the extinction of the dinosaurs here, and we'll get into that further on in the slide. So I think this is a brilliant image. It shows sort of life evolving on our planet. Okay, so the bigger question, the deeper question is, how did that original life start? Well, scientists have some hypotheses. We call it the origin of life hypothesis. So the first step in this hypothesis is that there was some abiotic, which you know means not living, synthesis of organic molecules. We know we are made up of organic molecules, carbon being the main one, of course. Carbon, meaning organic. So these molecules were synthesized abiotically. So because of the nature, the laws of the universe, this atom is attracted to this atom, they come together, they start forming larger molecules. So because there was some free energy available in the universe, those molecules naturally started coming together because of the properties of the universe. Then, of course, those assembled into more complex. So you take atoms coming together to form small molecules. Then you take smaller molecules coming together to form larger molecules like amino acids that we're used to seeing to make up proteins. Then those smaller molecules started self-assembling into larger polymers. So if you take the monomers, the amino acids, they go into polymers, proteins. If you saw the monomers, sugars, those would go into the polymers, carbohydrates. Eventually, these molecules started to replicate. So, and you know, this took a long time, millions and millions of years for this to start happening. And there you can see cellulose, which is, of course, a carbohydrate assembled from other monomers. So molecules started coming together, forming larger molecules. Eventually, those molecules started packaging themselves into droplets to protect themselves, right? There's a lot of harsh chemicals. The beginning of our planet, it was pretty harsh. Conditions weren't great. So what happened was these molecules somehow started protecting themselves into these what we call protobionts. Think proto like prototype, sort of a beginning life cell. And if you look over here, you can see what we might consider to be a protobiont or a protocell. These small little membrane-bound droplets inside that are protecting themselves. We might have even started to see a little bit of the beginning of nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And then, of course, things moved on from there. We suspect, or at least suspected till pretty recently, that RNA was probably our first genetic material. You might remember it's single-stranded. So there's a hypothesis that RNA was our earliest genetic material, although there's some recent evidence to support that maybe that's not the case. That's the great thing here about science. As we continue to learn and we continue to investigate, we're going to understand how this all started to begin with. So life really just started, according to this hypothesis, from molecules naturally being attracted to each other. Then those molecules forming larger molecules. Eventually those molecules wanted to protect themselves by making a membrane around them, right? And then genetic material started to assemble as well. So is there any evidence, Herder, that this hypothesis could have happened? Well, actually, there is quite a bit of famous evidence that shows that this was possible to form some complex organic molecules, like the ones that make us up, from inorganic molecules. And this famous scientist, Stanley Miller, really started this, did this experiment with partner Urey, Miller and Urey, famous experiment that took place in 1953. Okay, what do? Well, they tried to emulate the conditions on early Earth. So they took a lot of basic organic molecules like water, methane, ammonia, and they tried to emulate the conditions on early Earth. So probably a lot of lightning, so they put some sparks in there, and they had a heat source, things were circulating throughout this, and they collected to see over time, will these molecules naturally form into larger molecules, like the ones that make up living things? Well, guess what? When they let the simulation run, actually when they let the experiment run, they found there were a ton of amino acids that started to form. And later analysis of their experiment proved that there were probably close to 20 amino acids that were formed from this experiment. So this experiment, the Miller and Urey experiment, actually did show us that we can make large organic molecules that make living things up from these smaller inorganic molecules. So it showed us that this can happen. So I mentioned that these molecules eventually started to protect themselves. And we would call this a protobiont, right? That's when molecules want to form a barrier around them. Well, do you remember what might make a nice barrier? Lipids. Lipids, as you remember, these fats, have both a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic part. And so by molecules surrounding themselves with these membranes, packaging themselves into these membranes, they actually were protected. So we think these were our first cells. That is, molecules that had a membrane around for protection. We call those protobionts. So then the next thing to evolve would have been prokaryotes. So prokaryotes, we're pretty sure, dominated life on our Earth from about 3.5 to 2 billion years ago. And here you see a lot of diversity in prokaryotes, right? We know prokaryotes are pretty simple. This is probably why they're the first to evolve. Their life is just one single cell. They don't have membrane-bound organelles, like they don't have a nucleus, they don't have an ER. So these were the first to dominate and take over our planet about 3.5 to 2 billion years ago. And we actually have fossils of ancient bacteria on our Earth. As you can see here in this diagram, we've got these fossilized mats of prokaryotes that you can see are just these sheets of fossilized bacteria throughout our Earth's history. And it's interesting, if you look at them, you'll actually see that they kind of resemble modern microbial cultures. So if you were to look at a petri dish today of modern bacteria, you would notice that it actually resembles these colonies that you see over here. So life on our planet started with the smallest simple things called prokaryotes. Then finally, oxygen began to accumulate in our atmosphere about 2.7 billion years ago. How did that happen? Where did we get all this oxygen from? Well, it just so happens there were these cyanobacteria that started photosynthesizing. And cyanobacteria, you may also know as blue-green algae, they started photosynthesizing. And if you remember, or if you've seen my photosynthesis PowerPoint, you know that photosynthesis, the result is to produce oxygen. So these sort of ancient cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, were able in their cells to start producing oxygen. And that started to accumulate. If you look deep inside cyanobacteria, they even start to divide up and divide up the labor, or divide up what they're going to do. And of course, one of the important thing for life to begin was that the light then was converted through a series of processes, or the energy from the light was converted to oxygen. And so this oxygen really began to accumulate about 2.7 billion years ago. Well, now that we've got oxygen in our atmosphere, eukaryotes are primed and ready for evolution. So the evolution of eukaryotes started about 2.1 billion years ago with this idea of endosymbiosis. So endosymbiosis, just as a refresher, is this evolutionary theory or idea that eukaryotes evolved by engulfing and having a symbiotic relationship with other living things. So it took inside another living thing and lived symbiotically. So just to remind you of how this goes, let's say we have this ancient cell here. Over time, it's starting maybe to develop some internal membrane. That, of course, will become modern-day nucleus. And you'll start to see a little more membrane forming. Then we'll start to see our first eukaryote develop, right? Internal membrane starting to really take shape here. Well, the next thing that happened was pretty interesting. We suspect that these sort of early eukaryotic organisms actually engulfed chemo or mitochondria-like bacteria. Those are ones that were processing sugar, making energy, right? So we think that those ancient bacteria were just engulfed, and of course, we think that became modern-day mitochondria. So this would have been the ancestor to all modern-day animals, fungus, other heterotrophs, because they have mitochondria and they can process energy. Well, what about plants? Well, we think that these early cells actually engulfed some photosynthetic organism, perhaps like a cyanobacteria, and that became modern-day chloroplasts. So here we go. We're starting to get internal membranes. Now, because they've engulfed these other organisms, those over time are doing their own thing and processing and making energy for the cells. So this is when we think eukaryotes evolved, about 2.1 billion years ago, when they started having these membrane-bound organelles. And here we go. Finally, we think this would be our ancestor of all plants and algae, because you know that plants and algae, they have their own mitochondria, but they also have chloroplasts. All right, so eukaryotes, they're starting to take off, slowly evolving, and then about 543 million years ago, things exploded. We call this the Cambrian Explosion. And we actually see, and this is a crazy thing, within about 10 to 20 million years, which is a small time in terms of evolution, we start to see most of the major phyla, which is a category, of animals appear in our fossil record. So here's an artist's rendition of what it was like on our planet about 543 million years ago. Some of the most well-known species we think evolved during that time was the Opabinia, which is this crazy looking little thing here. It's got this sort of claw-like thing at the very protrusion up at the front. And then, of course, we have a ton of trilobite fossils that show us what we think life was like a long time ago in this Cambrian explosion. So then what about mammals? Well, things continued, life continued to evolve on our planet, and then we think the first mammals probably evolved from mammal-like reptiles called therapsids. So here's a little bit of a phylogenetic tree to trace back. Here we have tetrapods, which you know, 4 pods, 4 feet, evolving a long time before. There were starting to be on Earth 4-legged creatures. Eventually they developed amniotic eggs, right? And then you can see the spiral come down, right? You can see the pelycosaurs here. But mammals, we think, evolved from therapsids, which were reptiles which had some mammal-like characteristics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you even more detail. We're going to take this, we're going to put it here, and show you this line, all right? So from 4-legged, have eggs, all the way down here, then we take it down, and you can actually see from therapsids, you can see this evolution continue. So these are sort of mammal-like, right? Have eggs, 4 legs. Then it continues down to what we see as Theriodontia, which is beast with teeth, right? Think of dont like a dentist. And then we go down a little farther. You can see it becoming even more mammalian to cynodontia. You can finally see over time how we evolved from these reptile-like mammals known as therapsids, and that was about 220 million years ago. Eventually, of course, mammals. Now, we don't see humans yet, but we see these small mammal-like creatures that were starting to be on the planet. Well, then what happened? Big event. Changed life on our planet. We're pretty sure that an asteroid hit. In fact, if you look, we can see, if you look at the Chicxulub crater near the Yucatan Peninsula, all right, so here we are. Come down here to the Yucatan Peninsula, you can see there's this evidence of this huge crater. And even today, we can see where we think this crater hit because there's a lot of sinkholes, which is a sign of a gigantic impact. So we think this asteroid or comet hit the Earth about 65 million years ago. What did that do? Well, it completely changed life on this planet. This is known as one of the mass extinction events because it wiped out 3/4 of the plant and animal species on the Earth. So the impact of this asteroid on our planet was significant. We call it the Cretaceous Paleogene event. That is that mass extinction event that wiped out so many creatures on our planet. Now you might say, well, how do we survive if 3/4 of plant and animal life was wiped out because of this event? Well, what happened was when we have mass events like this on our mass extinction events, we always know that even though it wipes out some life, it now opens up new niches for other life to fill in. Well, what life do you think filled in at this point? Well, mammals. So the extinction of the dinosaurs from that asteroid event actually allowed smaller mammals to fill in the niches. And then, of course, as we know, we evolved from those mammals, and that allowed us to be alive and allowed us to evolve on this planet because of that event. And there are many scientists who think if that random asteroid hadn't hit our planet, we would not be here today, or the dominant creature on our planet, humans, mammals, the dominant apex predator would be something different, probably more reptilian. So it's an interesting thing to think about. So then we started to evolve hominids, right? So if you think about 3.3 to 2 million years ago, right? So that's a while after that asteroid hit in the 60 million years ago. All right, took a few million years. And then we started to see mammals evolve into hominids. And so Australopithecines, one of the famous ones we talk about. And then you can see over time, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens into today, you can notice some changes. And so one of the interesting changes that I like to note is how we changed and how human mutations over time slowed our jaw growth. So look at the size of the jaw here in Australopithecines. What you'll see over time is that's getting smaller and smaller. It slowed the jaw growth. Here, that then allowed this part to get bigger, right? If this growth is down here is slowed down, that means this growth up here can get bigger, and we know that gave us a chance for a bigger brain for our cerebrum. And there's actually a ton of evidence for this. You can actually look at these fossils that we've collected over time that literally show the evolution of hominids and how our brains changed or how our skulls changed to allow for bigger brains. There's several museums around that you can actually go to and look at these fossils and trace how our skull, how our cranium changed over time, and how we as humans, hominids, evolved over time. It's quite amazing to see if you ever get a chance to go to one of these museums and look at these fossils. So I've taken you on a journey here from what scientists suspect was the moment the universe was formed to today, where humans have become the dominant species, or the top of the food chain, we'll at least say, on our planet. And so it's been a long journey, right? Billions of years to get where we are today. So don't forget, you are the product of billions of years of evolution. You are, in a way, the universe trying to figure out itself. Think about that. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to like and subscribe so that we can continue to make more podcasts for you to learn and explore.